By subscribing to our channel, you can be informed about detailed reports every time. Iran's heavy missile attack on the US base in Syria during the day has fallen like a bomb on the agenda. With Iran's slow stance in nuclear agreements and increasing militant movements in Syria, the region has been facing intense Israeli attacks for the last month. Israel carried out the 8th missile attack, supported by airstrikes, against Iran in 40 days. Iran failed to protect its militants in southern Syria, and the militants suffered heavy casualties. As a result of Israel's use of U.S. airspace and airstrikes and the U.S. pressure on Iran in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, Iran has recently announced that it will respond to these attacks. Today, one of the largest U.S. military bases in Syria was bombed with a massive missile strike. Saying that the U.S. ignored Israel's attacks and covered it up, Iran seems to be intent on taking revenge from the U.S. According to information received from Syrian state agency Sana'a and local sources, 5 missiles were used in the attack. It was reported that at 2 a.m. local time, on Tuesday, rockets hit the U.S. military base Qarab al-Jur in a village near the border crossing in eastern Syria's Hasaka province. The rocket attack caused many deadly explosions and there were terrible explosions at the U.S. base. Missile attacks on the U.S. base today come 1 month after Iranian-backed militants hit the U.S. military base Al-Tanif with kamikaze drones and missiles. CENTCOM stated that it reserved the right to attack Iran after the attack 1 month ago. However, due to the nuclear negotiations, the U.S. Army has not taken any action against Iran. We will examine the details of the attack shortly. In the reports we shared with you as the Deep Journal in the past days, we conveyed that intelligence reports about this attack were shared and that the Iranian-backed militants in Syria were preparing to attack the U.S. bases. Iran has long gained the dislike of many countries with certain terrorist acts and nuclear activities in the Middle East. Iran, which triggered the chaos in the regions with the Hezbollah militants it placed in many countries in the Middle East and attacked the USA and Israel through these countries, also faced the reaction of the world countries with its intense dangerous nuclear studies. Serious operations were carried out after Israel declared that it would fight Iran with its own methods in this period. Especially after the statements of President Bennett, with the explosion or fire of many nuclear facilities in Iran, Iran said that Israel was responsible for these attacks. In response to these moves by Israel, Iran transferred its militants, which it had been feeding in Syria for a long time, to the southern part of Syria and carried out serious shipments of tanks and missiles to the Golan Heights. It was a reality seen by everyone that Iran was preparing a major attack on Israel. But Israeli airstrikes thwarted Iran's plans. While Israel hit many Iranian headquarters with its airstrikes, it also destroyed the most important shipping depots in the region, along with the intelligence reports. The most important factor for Israel to reach this point was the U.S. force in the region and Russia's opening the Syrian airspace to Israel. After today's attacks, U.S. aircraft and helicopters began to operate in the region. According to local sources, the United States reportedly bombed several Iranian-backed militant headquarters during the night. The fact that the U.S. operates with many planes and helicopters shows that the attacks carried out by the Iranian-backed militants in Syria will not be limited to this. In the news, which is reported to be an extraordinary militant activity, it is claimed that Iran will implement a policy of intimidation by making many successive attacks on U.S. bases. Another aim of these attacks is thought to be to cut the support of the USA to Israel. It is very possible that Iran, which fell into a difficult situation after the cooperation of the USA and Israel in the region, made such a move. Because the militants it supports against these two countries are helpless. Knowing that it will suffer a great loss of power if the militants in Syria fall, Iran is also worried that it will be its turn later on. Russia, on the other hand, is seizing and settling the bases abandoned by the USA after these attacks. It is thought that Russia's agreement with Israel, which has made the biggest profit from the conflicts between Iran and the USA in the region, serves this purpose. Now let's examine the details of the missile attacks on the U.S. base. The Qarab al-Jur military base used by U.S. forces in the Hasaka governorate in northeastern Syria has been shelled with rockets, the Sana news agency reported on Tuesday. According to its information, 5 rockets were fired upon the military airfield at the Qarab al-Jur base used by U.S. forces. The agency noted that immediately following the attack by series of rockets on largest U.S. base near Al-Hasaka province, several U.S. helicopters were scrambled trying to detect the area where the rockets were launched. In addition, a multiple rocket attack took place on the largest American airbase in eastern Syria on Tuesday the 23rd of November, reported Iran state-affiliated media, Tehran Times. The latest attack on the U.S. base in Syria came just days after a New York Times reported that pro-Iranian militants carried out a drone attack on an American base, also in Syria, as a response to Israeli airstrikes on Iranian-backed militants. In the 20th of October, the U.S. base of Al-Tanif attacked by Iranian-backed militants with missile and kamikaze drones. At 2 a.m. local time on Tuesday, the rockets reportedly hit the American base in the village nearby to the border crossing in the eastern Syrian province of Al-Hasaka. A rocket attack against a U.S. base near the Syrian-Iraqi border led to several deadly explosions, local sources reported on Tuesday. Terrible explosions shook the U.S. base in a village, located 5 kilometers from the Al-Yarubiya town in Al-Hasaka Governorate, Syria. The blasts followed the firing of 4 rockets at the base, the source of which is still unknown. After October attack, the U.S. said it reserved the right to response. Meanwhile, the White House, which denounced the October attack, reportedly believed that the attack on Al-Tanif military base in Syria was deliberate and coordinated, and that the U.S. reserved the right to respond. U.S. officials even told NYT that the attack had been directed by Iran, which supplied the proxy forces with the required equipment. Additionally, both U.S. and Israeli officials said that the attack was a retaliation for multiple airstrikes on Syria carried out by Israel. U.S. had confirmed that no U.S. military injuries or deaths were recorded after the coordinated attack was targeted at a small remote American military base in Syria. Meanwhile, Russia takes over third U.S. base in Syria. Russian military police have taken over another base that was recently abandoned by the United States in northern Syria, the Russia state-run TASS news agency reported Thursday. U.S. troops reportedly held the former school building as a base north of Raqqa, the former de facto capital of the Islamic State terrorist group, until days ago. Russian television showed soldiers hoisting the national flag on its rooftop and armored vehicles assembling nearby. The unit will be deployed by day's end and will start patrols today, TASS quoted Russian military police officer Armen Mambatov as saying. The Defense Ministry's TV Zvezda news channel reported that special units were the first to assume key positions at the base in the village of Tal Samin. Bomb disposal experts then inspected the site for mines before the main forces entered the territory and raised the Russian flag, the broadcaster said. Russia's capture of the Tal Samin base is the latest example of the country's troops filling a void left by U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to withdraw U.S. troops from northern Syria in October. Russia has since landed helicopters and troops at a former U.S. airbase in Kamishli and overtook another U.S. airbase in Tabqa. Russian forces entered Raqqa earlier this month. Kurdish-led forces backed by U.S. airstrikes liberated Raqqa in 2017, 3 years after the Islamic State captured the city in its advance through Syria and Iraq. The United Nations said that the self-proclaimed caliphate's mass killings and enslavement of minorities were a genocide. Russia intervened in Syria in 2015 on the side of Syrian government forces in their campaign against rebels and jihadists. In the NY Times report, which we mentioned at the beginning of the news, the U.S. defends the Syrian airstrike, which was investigated by the NY Times, as legitimate.